So, you came back. I'm glad. Don't look at the window tonight. Not directly. It is time for chapter 57. His reflection moved before he did, not dramatically, not in a way that was immediately undeniable, simply a fraction of a second ahead, as though whatever was in the glass had anticipated his movement, had known what he was going to do before he did it. He stood completely still and watched his reflection in the dark window. It stood still too, correctly, immediately, as though it had noticed him noticing and had decided to be more careful. He moved his left hand slowly. His reflection moved its left hand at exactly the right moment, exactly as though it had learned from its mistake and was not going to make it again. A man lived alone in a small apartment on an upper floor of a residential building. His living room had a large window that faced the street below. At night, with the lights on inside, the window became a mirror, a clear and detailed reflection of the room and everything in it. He had lived with this unremarkable feature of the apartment for months without giving it particular thought. Most people who live in apartments with large windows learn to ignore their nighttime reflections entirely. It becomes simply part of the visual landscape of the room, background, unnoticed, until the evening he glanced at the window and saw his reflection standing slightly differently than he was standing, a subtle difference, but unmistakable once noticed. He stood still and looked at his reflection carefully. It adjusted, settled into the correct position. He told himself he had imagined it. That tiredness had made him misread what he had seen. He moved to the other side of the room. His reflection moved with him, correctly, immediately, in perfect correspondence. He stood still again and watched it. Normal. Entirely normal. He went to bed and thought nothing more of it, but the following evening he noticed it again, a slight delay, a fraction of a second in which his reflection remained where it was before following him, too brief to be certain, too consistent to be dismissed. He began watching the window deliberately, and the window, he gradually understood, had begun watching back. If these stories find their way to you, if you feel drawn back to this quiet room again and again, there is a place for you here. Others have found it. Perhaps you will tell them you did too. The delays became more pronounced over the following nights, not dramatically, but consistently. He would turn and his reflection would turn a half-second later. He would sit and his reflection would remain standing for a moment before sitting. Small differences, the kind that could always be attributed to tired eyes or the particular quality of the glass. Except that they happened every night, with increasing regularity, with the steady and gradual quality of something that was becoming less careful about being noticed. He began keeping the curtains closed after dark. His reflection disappeared. The curtains remained still, but occasionally, on certain nights, he noticed the curtains move, very slightly, as though something behind them had shifted position. He opened the curtains one final time, deliberately. He wanted to see it clearly. He stood in the center of the room and looked directly at his reflection in the dark glass of the window. His reflection looked back. Still. Correct. In perfect correspondence with his own position. He stood and watched it for a long time. Nothing unusual. He was almost ready to accept that he had been imagining things. Then he let both arms hang at his sides, completely still, and watched his reflection raise its right hand, slowly, deliberately, to approximately shoulder height, and hold it there. While both of his own hands remained at his sides, he closed the curtains and did not open them again. He moved out of that apartment within the month. He told the landlord only that he had found somewhere more convenient. He did not mention the window. He did not mention the reflection. He took nothing from the apartment that he had not brought with him. He left the curtains closed. He thought about the next tenant occasionally, about whether they would open the curtains on their first evening, about whether they would notice anything unusual in the glass, about whether whatever had taken up residence in that window would be patient enough to wait for them to start watching before it started moving on its own again. I think about reflections sometimes, about what they represent, the image of ourselves returned to us from a surface. Most reflections are faithful, accurate, immediate, but some surfaces, particularly old glass in apartments where certain things have had time to settle and establish themselves, some surfaces hold something other than light, something that has learned the shape of the person who stands before them, has practiced their movements, has grown comfortable enough in that practice to occasionally, in the quiet of a late evening, try one of those movements out, just slightly, just enough to see if it will be noticed, and what will happen if it is. Another whispered story from Japan, shared quietly here beside the kotatsu. Most reflections are simply reflections. Most windows are simply windows. But if you live in an apartment with a large window that becomes a mirror at night, pay attention to your reflection occasionally, not obsessively, simply occasionally. Watch whether it moves when you move, whether it stops when you stop, whether both of its hands are always where both of your hands are. Because something that has taken up residence in a pane of glass has very little to do, except watch and practice and wait for the evening when you are tired enough or distracted enough to not notice immediately, when it decides to raise its hand, and see what you do next. If this story stayed with you, if the dark or the shadow feels a little closer tonight, you know where to find me. I am always here, beside the kotatsu, watching, waiting. And if you wish others to find their way here too, I would not object.